Hello and welcome to Aspects of History. I'm Oliver Webb Carter and I'm the editor. If you're new to Aspects of History, we're a magazine and website dedicated to history and historical fiction. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com where you'll find articles, interviews, book reviews and short stories, and they're all absolutely free. Our magazine is at the insanely cheap price of under a tenner for a year's subscription, and that's under a tenner in American as well. Anyway, on to the podcast. If you enjoy it, please give it a great rating. It'll help us carry on running them. This is the second part in our discussion with Roger Moorhouse, the author of First to Fight, the account of the invasion of Poland in 1939. If you've started with this episode, I'd recommend you stop and go back to number 1 and listen to that, where we discuss the opening shots of World War II. For the rest of you, welcome back. If you enjoy our discussion, please give us a good rating.
So you've mentioned this, and it's one of the outstanding images of the war in Poland, the invasion of Poland, which is the cavalry against tanks. Mm-hmm. But as you've exploded this myth really in the book, because it's propaganda. Yeah, propaganda. Well, I certainly think you did, because it comes across this is propaganda from the Germans. But I think it would be great to hear a little bit about that. I mean, they had some major successes against the Germans.
Yeah, the German sort of propaganda image or stereotype that they gave, both for a domestic and an international audience, and of course for all the sort of pseudo memoirs that came out in the years that followed about the Polish campaign, was that the Poles attacked. The Poles were all on horseback. Or infantry, and the Germans are all in tanks, right? That's the kind of the stereotype image that they gave. So the Germans are always pictured, blonde, chiseled cheekboned young men riding atop German panzers or in aircraft. And the Poles are always, rather sort of unshaven and shoddy looking and usually prisoners, but they're certainly not in tanks and aircraft. And so that's the kind of stereotype that they gave. And of course, you have to bear in mind that the Germans have more cavalry in 1939 than the Poles do. So the Germans have more of everything. So it's not like the Germans are all in tanks and the Poles are all on horseback. That's just nonsense. But the Polish cavalry was actually quite effective. It was certainly it was the creme de la creme of the Polish army at the time, very well trained. They fought dismounted, so they're not sort of carrying the lance or anything like that. This is not like a Napoleonic cavalry, which is, I think, the image that people still tend to have. They fought dismounted. They used to sort of tow these small artillery pieces with them. They had anti-tank rifles, which were very effective in 1939. And they used to sort of use the horse itself for mobility and get themselves into position. Then the horses would be taken away. Taken to the rear, and it actually worked quite well. And there's a very good example from the first day of the war, the Battle of Mokra, which is right down in the southwest near the Silesian border, and that's where the German 4th Panzer Army is attacking. And at Mokra, they managed to sort of maneuver the Germans into this sort of cul-de-sac by sort of funneling them in between trees and so on. And there, I think it was the Volhynian Cavalry Brigade. It was. Actually held the Germans off for most of that first day, the 1st of September. They held them off in a sort of pitched battle. And it is tanks against, cavalrymen. It's not cavalrymen on horseback. They're dismounted and they're fighting with their artillery pieces and everything else. But, they do hold them off, which is quite a remarkable feat. Now, bear in mind, this is a cavalry brigade holding back a panzer division, right? This is not how military history is supposed to work. That should be a walkover. And they held them back, and they withdrew under cover of darkness, and established new defensive lines and so on. But so that I think needs to be counted as a Polish success, Mokra, and there are other examples as well. And actually, where the cavalry had the chance, if they were faced by infantry, they could still do a traditional cavalry charge. And that could be tremendously effective against infantry. And the Germans were terrified of that, because a couple of examples where, Guderian would go, there's one, Guderian talks about this, he goes to the front and the rumor suddenly goes around that the Polish cavalry is coming. And all these German infantrymen start turning around and running. I mean, this is not the sort of standard image that we have of the September campaign. So we have to a little bit rewrite that and get away from these sort of rather simplistic images of cavalrymen, foolishly charging German tanks, because it didn't happen, first of all, and secondarily, this is pure Nazi propaganda. So the fact that we're still having to sort of bat away these rather ridiculous stories 80 years on is rather preposterous.
Yes, absolutely. And so compounding. I mean, it's such a tragic story, because compounding the Nazi invasion, we have on the 17th of September the Soviets invade, but that invasion it comes across very differently to the German invasion, in that many of the Soviets themselves seem a bit confused by their invasion. And the Poles too. I mean, could you talk about that? Yeah.
Well, that's entirely deliberate. This is the Soviet method of warfare, and it's largely unchanged, really. I mean, it runs all the way through into to Putin's Russia. You look at how the Russian army, has dealt with and is dealing currently with its invasion of Ukraine. Its forces in eastern Ukraine was done largely in the same way. It's always sort of denying that we're there at all. We're not there at all. These are sort of locals. They're irregulars. They're, there are soldiers on holiday, or whatever they describe them as. And that's very much the same. The same playbook is being played out in 1939. The Soviet invasion is at dawn on the 17th of September, and actually the Germans have been in touch with the Soviets. I mean, this is something that I write in quite some detail, how that the contact between Berlin and Moscow had sort of played out in the intervening couple of weeks, because the Germans are basically saying to the Soviets all the way through, well, when are you coming in? When are you joining this enterprise? Because that's how they imagined it would be. So the current narrative, as you can see, told by sort of Soviet Russian sympathizers and the Russian foreign ministry and so on, they'll say, well, the Soviet forces only entered Poland once the government had collapsed, and they were welcomed by the local people, and it was kind of a humanitarian operation. That's how they portray it, and that's how they portrayed it at the time. That was the narrative. When you look at original sources, and that was deliberate. I mean, they wanted to basically kind of essentially creep in so that the Germans take all the blame for the invasion of Poland, that they can present a narrative to the world that is basically, we are not aggressors. We are just sort of, carrying out a humanitarian stroke police operation in these territories that are next to our frontier. So that Stalin can basically preserve his sort of precious supposed neutrality in World War II. But let's not mistake this. The Soviet Union under Stalin between 39 and 41 is essentially Hitler's ally, and a more important ally, arguably, than anyone else was, including Mussolini. So there's trade deals between the two. There's sort of military envoys are exchanged, and trade envoys are exchanged, and so on. So there's all sorts of high-level contacts between the two. So they are allies in all but name for that 22 months, which we forget. So when the Soviet army rolls into eastern Poland, it is very obviously an invasion. And you can look at the orders. I quote the orders to the troops on the ground, which basically talks about, using a lightning war, so swift moving units to basically sort of target particular strongholds, target particular sites, particular buildings, particular cities, and so on. It's very obviously a military invasion. There's nothing really humanitarian about it. That's eyewash. So again, that's another myth that still persists right up to 2021. And needs to be battered away as well. We need to get rid of the idea that this wasn't an invasion, because it obviously was. That said, the warfare that results is actually rather different, partly because the Poles in the east are very limited in number, so they're mainly just border troops who don't have, any air cover. They don't have artillery even, so they're merely infantrymen or policemen, effectively. So in some places they fight back, and in many places they realise that it's foolish to fight back, so they simply retreat. And in many cases they are fooled into surrendering, or basically they imagine that, and they're told that, that the forces that are coming to meet them are coming to join the fight against the Germans. And this was a deliberate tactic. This is where I come back to this idea of desinformatia and disinformation, which is an old Soviet trick. So Polish forces are really, have no chance against the Red Army in 1939, but they are still tricked into not fighting to a large extent. Because the Soviets come in with this narrative that we are coming to help you, and nothing to fear. We are we are your Slavic brothers. We're coming to help you against the dastardly Germans. And as soon as they, arrive at whatever it is, the barracks or whatever, soldiers are disarmed, and that's that. And then they're sorted between officers and men, and the officers very often are taken off and shot by the Soviets. So it's a really thoroughly dastardly campaign. Just as the Germans are effectively carrying out race war in the West, so the Soviets are carrying out class war in the East.
So what was interesting, and I guess this is the nature of Poland itself, in that it has a number of ethnic nationalities, non-Polish, as it were, ethnic Belarusian, Ukrainian, and ethnic Germans as well. I mean, what was their lived experience in Poland leading up to the war? Because that was often used as an excuse for both sides to invade.
Yeah, it wasn't great. I mean, Poland, if you were in somewhere like Warsaw or Krakow in 39, you could have been anywhere. It was as sort of cultured as anywhere else in Europe, arguably. But then it's very, very mixed. Outside of those areas, it's very, very mixed. And it gets worse and worse and more primitive the further east you go. So the eastern sort of counties, the Kresy as it's known, those eastern territories are pretty primitive, really, economically and socially and so on. And you tend to have, the sort of upper echelons, the merchants, the administrative class tended to be Polish or Jewish. And then they're in a mass of, essentially, Belarusian in the north or Ukrainian in the south, sort of labourers and peasants. So sort of islands of Polishness in a sort of Ukrainian and Belarusian sea, really. And the Belarusians and Ukrainians, it's not like they're sort of persecuted in a real material way, but there's sort of low level prejudice against them. Essentially, it's the same thing as, it's sort of what we'd now call Orientalism, that the Poles, to some extent, looked down on the Ukrainians and the Belarusians as rather more primitive and less civilized than they were. So that it didn't mean they necessarily put them in camps or anything like that, but they were sort of, low level prejudice against them. So it wasn't a great place to be if you're a Ukrainian or Belarusian peasant. But then, of course, as soon as the Red Army marches in and starts proclaiming sort of brotherhood of all nationalities and, the union of all Belarusians and union of all Ukrainians and all of that, that's quite a seductive message, both on a national level, but also on a social, political level, class level. So a lot of those Ukrainians and Belarusians in Poland sort of welcome the Red Army. The Poles themselves, of course, don't. They pretty swiftly realise that this is a hostile operation. But they are welcomed to some extent by Ukrainian, Belarusian elements of those populations, yes.
So the suffering of the Polish during the war, it's difficult to find another country that suffered more. Both sides, Nazis and Soviets, there are numerous accounts in your book of executions and other such atrocities. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, as I've said, very simply, the Germans come in the West with essentially a racial agenda, and this is something I think we kind of ignore to some extent. I think the Western narrative of World War II really. It doesn't really get going with sort of Nazi atrocities really until 41. That's the stereotype. Really, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Then we have this, the opening of the Holocaust by bullets, as it's known, the Einsatzgruppen and so on. And that's where you see this sort of galloping barbarization of warfare. And the assumption that's often made in that Western narrative is that everything up until 1941 was all pretty much fine and dandy and fairly chivalrous, because the Western experience was fairly chivalrous. So, the French campaign was relatively chivalrous. Of course, the British and the French lost badly, but there weren't too many atrocities in the French campaign. The same with North Africa. The North African campaign was relatively clean, mainly because the SS wasn't there. In France and Belgium in 1940, for example, there are something like 20 odd massacres carried out, mainly of POWs, and mainly of French colonial POWs. So black prisoners who obviously excite the ire of the SS on racial grounds, and they're very often, routinely taken to the rear and shot. And then a couple of, quite famous massacres of British troops at Paradis and Wormhout, for example, which are well known in 1940. So there's about 20 odd massacres in a 6-week campaign. And if you compare that to the number of massacres that we know about carried out by the Germans alone in Poland, only 8 months earlier, in September 1939, over a similar period, 5 weeks versus 6 weeks, we know about, there are over 600 massacres carried out by the Germans in that period. And that statistic alone speaks volumes, because all of the other possible contributory factors are the same. So, you could argue, well, it was Blitzkrieg, and Blitzkrieg kind of, the intention of Blitzkrieg is to sort of fracture the front line so that troops don't know what they're doing and who's behind them and who's in front of them. Which means that civilians inevitably get caught in the crossfire and in the mix, and that's bad for them, and they tend to get caught in the crossfire and so on. You could argue that the troops are green, and they're a bit German troops are a bit green and a bit nervous, a bit trigger happy. You could say that, but so all of those factors apply in France as much as they apply in Poland in 1939. The difference is how the Germans view their enemy. And they view the French and the British essentially as fellow civilized nations. They view the Poles as fundamentally expendable, racial trash, people who are, a nationality that's not only has the gall to resist the German advance, but also, worse than that, is, thoroughly sort of infected with Jewishness. It has this large Jewish population, which, taints the rest of the population. So from the Nazi perspective, the Poles, there's nothing worth saving in Poland. So if you happen to, walk past the basement of a burning building, and you know that there are children and women and children in that basement who are cowering from your advance, you'd throw a couple of hand grenades in there. It doesn't matter. It fundamentally did not matter. No German soldier was going to be prosecuted for shooting a couple of civilians or throwing that hand grenade in a basement. So there's a fundamental difference in the attitude of German troops. And that, I think, that explains that disparity between the atrocities carried out in the West and the atrocities carried out in the East. So the barbarism of warfare that we sometimes say, we assume, that just kicks on in 1941. It's right there in 1939. It's right there at the beginning. And it's racially driven. And that's something we have to remember. And that's a key lesson, I think, that the September campaign tells us. It tells us that barbarism is there right from the beginning.
And then added to that, you have the Soviet class-based executions. I mean, Katyn is probably the most famous example, but I was gobsmacked reading the number of smaller scale, admittedly, but hugely widespread executions of officers and non-commissioned officers. Yeah,
it was routine. The standard routine when they sort of captured Polish forces in 1939, the Soviets, was that you'd separate the ordinary ranks from the officers. The ordinary ranks would be marched off to some sort of sorting establishment, and the officers generally were taken out and shot. And this is class warfare. This is, you can see it you can see it later on in the Soviet occupation, because there's a deliberate targeting of anyone who had political links to the old regime, anyone that was a member of the authorities of the old regime, MPs, doctors, priests, any of those sort of natural elites, if you like, would be targeted by both sides. Actually, both the Germans and the Soviets in the later occupation of Poland are deliberately targeting the Polish elites. They want to decapitate Polish society, to render it, completely incapable of defending itself. But that, both sides are doing that. I mean, the Germans start doing that. Those operations really towards the end of the September campaign and into October and following into 1940. And there are various sites where that's carried out. I mean, one of the most well known is Palmyra, just outside Warsaw, which is a killing ground where they used to take people from Warsaw. But the Soviets are doing that already in 1939, and it's routine. This is class warfare, where they were very consciously exporting communism into Poland, and that meant you had to physically get rid of those people that might possibly resist you, which is the officer class, which is the former policemen, which is the administration, which is the school teachers. Knowledge is power, and that's something that the Soviet system wants to get rid of.
Well, I have one final question really on this. It's such an extraordinary event, really, but such a major one for us in Britain. It prompted our declaration of war.
Yeah.
And it resulted in these extraordinary events, as you say. But why do we not know more about it here in this country? The Polish experience.
It's a very good question. It's one that I've sort of wrestled with a lot. I think there are many reasons. One of the reasons, I think, is that we have traditionally had a sort of an academic system. Now, if you look at where when the universities are set up, for example, in this country, there's a sort of high preponderance of German studies. Germany is seen as a sort of a beacon of philosophy and music and culture and all of that, rightly so, in the 19th century. So there's lots of every university founded at the time has an Institute of German Studies, and to a large extent similar with Russia. Russia is the sort of cultured element of Russian history is seen as very significant, rightly so, and that's studied at universities. But Poland, at that time when the universities are being set up, Poland didn't exist. It wasn't on the map. It was divided up between its three neighbours: Russia, Austria, and Prussia, and Prussia, or Germany. So that's, I think, one reason that there's a sort of blind spot with Poland. It doesn't fit. There are other more pressing, more significant, more interesting, maybe narratives and stories to be told from that region. So that's a sort of more fundamental reason. And then if you jump forward to a sort of more proximate reason, I suppose the simple answer is, well, the victors tell the history, write the history. Nobody had a vested interest in telling the story of the September campaign after the war. So obviously the Germans don't. The Germans have, once they start investigating their own past and expiating their crimes from the Second World War, which is well into the sort of late 50s, early 60s, they have bigger fish to fry. They have to get their heads around the Holocaust, for example. So, what they did in Poland is kind of irrelevant, doesn't really get talked about. The British and the French have their own narratives of the war, which are to some extent, largely self-congratulatory, and they put ourselves front center. And we don't really talk about elements of the history of the war that don't involve us in the first instance, and secondarily elements of the war in which actually we don't come out looking particularly positive. So that's the reason why we didn't tend to talk about it. The Soviets, of course, were never there, so they lied all the way through. They lied about the invasion in 1939, and subsequently with communist Poland, there was no need and no requirement to talk honestly about the September campaign. If anything, they just wanted to damn the pre-war regime as the puppet of the Western powers and capitalist and rotten and all of that stuff. So there was nobody there effectively to tell the story honestly. arguably until 1989, 1990, when Poland is finally free of communism, free from the Soviet regime. And then you can have the space for a generation of Polish historians to actually research and tell the story themselves. But as I said, for the reasons I said at the beginning, those historians and researchers generally don't get translated, so they don't come into the English language. It never penetrates the Western narrative. So it leaves it for people like me, 20 years on or 30 years on, to sort of pull up that material and process it and go back to the archives and try and prepare that narrative, the Polish narrative, for a Western audience. And if I can start the ball rolling on that, then I think that's a tremendous success as far as I'm concerned, because the next time that someone writes one of these sort of synthesis accounts of the Second World War, they won't be able, I think, to get away with just writing a couple of paragraphs or a couple of pages on the September campaign without including a lot of Polish material, because it's all there now. You can't say that material wasn't available, because I've made a lot of it available in the book. So if that's one result of the book, is that it means that the September campaign gets more than a couple of paragraphs or a couple of pages, then that's got to be seen as a win. And I hope so.
Well, I think you've certainly achieved that, Roger, and it's an important book, so our listeners need to read it. It's First to Fight.
Thank you,
in America, it's Poland 1939. We've got links in the description. It goes well with Devil's Alliance, the Hitler-Stalin Pact. I need to read that. I haven't read that. I need to read that. Yes. So, Roger, what's next?
The next one I'm working on at the moment is a book on the Holocaust. It's a sort of a very rare feel-good story from the Holocaust, which is about a group called the Ładoś Group, which was a group of diplomats and Jewish activists who were systematically forging Latin American passports, which were then sort of shipped into the ghettos to try and save Jews from the Holocaust. So, it's estimated that they saved something like 3,000 people in total, which is twice as many as Schindler, for example. So, and this isn't known. It's not really known about at all. This would be the first book on it in English, certainly. It's a fabulous story, lots of sort of human interest in it, and as I say, it's a rare feel-good story from a very, very dark period.
Well, that sounds fantastic, very interesting. And when do you think that's going to be coming out?
That should be spring of 23.
Well, we'll come back. I'll put it in the diary now. But
excellent,
Roger. Thanks so much for talking to us.
My pleasure.
And we'll speak to you again soon, hopefully.
Thanks, Ollie.
I hope you enjoyed that, and thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more, head over to our website, where you'll find articles from Roger on this period and others, as well as links to all his books. We also have numerous contributions from best-selling and acclaimed historians and authors, all available for free at aspectsofhistory.com. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can even email us at history@aspectsofhistory.com. We'll be back soon with another chat, this time with Sarah Griswold. She's the author of a new book, Tudors in Love, and we'll be discussing the passionate lives of Henry VIII, Queen Mary, Elizabeth I, and of course the one that still excites so much passion today, Anne Boleyn. Thank you and goodbye.